Huh?
We're bodies, work together.
I know. I've got a lot of weaknesses, though. I don't really like that. I'm terrible at everything. They could only see what my wife does, like, at home compared with what I do. Maybe I should just sweep floors for a living. All right. John 18:15 through 27. So, let me give you, I put together this a little bit so that we could kind of, it's a little bit easier for me to follow along because I'm a visual person. I'm not necessarily an auditory person. So, if the message permits, I like to put together a few slides, give you some visuals as we go through. But we're just going to walk our way through about these, 12 verses here, 13 verses in John chapter 18. So let me go ahead and review what we talked about last Sunday. So we've seen that Judas has already agreed to betray Jesus. We've gone through the Last Supper, which John spends a number of chapters on, specifically the teaching of Jesus. Jesus predicts Peter's denial, that he will deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. They travel together to the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas is not in that party. He's going off to get the religious leaders and the Pharisees and to gather them together and lead them to Jesus. Now, when they get to the Garden of Gethsemane, John skips this point, but the other gospel writers say that Jesus goes off by himself and prays 3 times by himself, comes back every time, and what are the disciples doing? They're sleeping. I don't know what time it is. Let's say it's midnight. They've had a long day. We have this mob that arrives, and in the context of this confrontation, Peter fights back. He cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant named Malchus. Jesus, I think, basically saves Peter's life from being killed. He heals Malchus's ear, and he willingly submits to this arresting mob. Jesus is arrested and taken into custody. So that's kind of where we're at this point as we pick up in John. Now, just a reminder, remember last week, there's a few passages I want to show you from Mark and Luke specifically today. But remember last week, John is an eyewitness. He's writing down from memory. Matthew is an eyewitness. He's writing down from memory. Mark is a very close associate. So the Gospel of Mark, he got most of his information, scholars believe, from Peter. And then Luke is a co-worker, a close associate of the Apostle Paul. So we've got eyewitness testimony, and all 4 of the Gospels are going to talk about what we're going to look at today, what we're going to address today. I'll leave that up for a moment. So let's take a look at just the first few verses in John chapter 18, verse 15. I'm going to take you on a rabbit trail here in a moment. I don't know why I get into things like this, but I just do. And you'll see here in a moment what I'm talking about. All right, so John chapter 18, verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Now, the other disciple, he's talking about John the Apostle. Simon Peter and John following Jesus. Because this disciple, John, was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back and spoke to the servant girl on duty there and brought Peter in. So my question, scholars are pretty much universally in agreement. There is some disagreement. You're always going to find different theories. But Simon Peter, verse 15, and this other apostle, the one whom Jesus loved, he really never refers to himself by his own name, is the Apostle John. So the question becomes here, how did John have connections with the high priest's family? He got into the high priest's courtyard. In the Middle East, everything's in a compound, so you've got multiple buildings inside a walled compound. So he gets into the high priest's courtyard. What's really interesting, remember last week, John is the only one of the 4 gospel writers that mentions the high priest's servant's name as Malchus. He records the name. And here's my question, was this miracle of Jesus healing his ear, did that become well known throughout Jerusalem, and it kind of became famous, and everybody knew Malchus's name because of that, and that's why John wrote it down? Or did John have connections and familiarity with the high priest family? And if this was the chief servant of the high priest, and John, verse 15 or 16, because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. Did John have connections? And he was familiar. He might not have known him, Malchus, on a personal level, but he knew who Malchus was, and he recorded his name. So this kind of brought me on a rabbit trail. I just want to share this with you. How might John have had a connection with the high priest's family? Okay. So I talked to Kristen about this, and let me introduce some scriptures to you. All right. Luke chapter 1, verse 36 says that when Gabriel's speaking to Mary, and he says to Mary, Elizabeth, your relative, is pregnant. So Mary and Elizabeth are related, okay? I need you to follow me down like a couple steps here. All right. In all likelihood, Elizabeth is probably at least 30 years older than Mary. I don't think they were first cousins. They might have been second cousins, and I'll show you a chart here in a moment. I'll tell you why this is important. In Luke chapter 1, verse 5, we see that Elizabeth and Zechariah are from the tribe of Levi. All right? They're descendants of Aaron. He's a priest. And we find in Luke chapter 1, verse 39, that Zechariah and Elizabeth live in the hill country of Judea. I'm working the hourglass down to a fine point here in a moment. All right, let me show you a picture. So Mary is living up the Sea of Galilee in the north, and the hill country of Judea is beneath Jerusalem, south of Jerusalem, between Hebron and Jerusalem. So this would have been Mary's path to get down to the hill country of Judea, where Elizabeth and Zechariah lived. And remember, Zechariah was a priest, so there were 24 divisions of priests. Each division, each grouping of priests served 1 week at a time, twice a year. All right, so all the priests they were all spread out all over Israel. And for twice a year, for 1 week increments, that grouping would go to Jerusalem and they would serve at the temple complex. All right? And Zechariah, we know, he didn't live up in the north. He lived down near Jerusalem in the hill country of Judea. Now, this map is not a very good one, but you can kind of, it's very blurry. But it's very close to Bethlehem. And remember, where was Joseph and Mary from? Joseph and Mary were from the tribe of Judah, and they had to return to Bethlehem to register in the census, okay? So here's where I'm going with this. Mary and Joseph, tribe of Judah. I'm going to put this up and read a couple more verses to you. I'm going to read these 3 verses. I think there is a case to be made that John the Apostle's mother and Mary were sisters, which would make Jesus and John the Apostle and John and James, they would have been first cousins. Okay? Now just listen to these, and I want you to look at this chart. And many women who followed Jesus from Galilee ministered to Jesus, and were there looking on from afar. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joses, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. See the Zebedee's sons. Okay. Here's the next passage. This is from Mark chapter 15. There were also women looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less and of Joses, and Salome, who also followed him and ministered to him and when he was in Galilee. All right, and then this is John chapter 19, verse 25. There stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. So when you kind of add all of this up in a chart form based upon these verses, it appears as if Salome is the sister of Mary. Right? Now, we don't know this for certain, but if this is true, that would mean that Jesus and John were cousins, okay? And that both of them were related to Elizabeth and Zachariah. And if Zachariah's one of the priests, remember, he got selected to go into the inner temple to burn incense, which is a very, that only happened one person. Well, I think it happened twice a day, just twice a day by one person. So in a whole day, 365 priests, that's a singular responsibility. So is it possible that Zechariah had connections with the high priest, and that through those connections, both Jesus and John the Baptist had some sort of, Jesus and John the Apostle had some sort of connections with the high priest? I don't know. But you also know this. Who are the two disciples that followed John the Baptist? Were originally disciples of John the Baptist. Andrew, not Peter, Andrew, and John, not James. So both of them had been disciples of John the Baptist before they switched to Jesus. So we don't know. Scholars really don't know. Let me put this up. I guess you could insert Jesus here, or you could insert Mary, the mother of Jesus, brother and sister, Salome. But how were they related to Elizabeth? I don't fully understand that. That's a helpful chart, but some of you might be able to pick up on that faster than I can. But it's possible through, it's possible that Elizabeth was a relative of both of them, and through that connection, they had a connection to the high priest household. All right. So, just wanted to present that to you. It's of no major value, but it was a rabbit trail that I ran down this week. Verse 17, take a look. So as Peter's entering the courtyard and the servant girl lets him in, verse 17 says that the servant asked Peter, "You aren't one of this man's disciples, are you?" She asked Peter. And he replied, "I am not." Now, so this is the first time that Peter denies Christ. It's a simple question, and it's kind of posed there's not much suspicion there, but it's kind of posed as a 50-50. You're not one of his disciples, are you? Could go either way. And as you're going to see with the next two questions, it moves from a place of suspicion to more certainty in the individuals who are asking the question. They become more certain that Peter is one of the disciples. But at this point, it's kind of a 50-50 question, and Peter says no. He does not identify with Jesus. Then verse 18 says, "It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself." Now, some of us have been to Israel before. This captured my attention. That word cold. So there's debate as to what year did Jesus die. There's debate on this, but if it was 30 AD, 33 AD, it was. You can go back in time and you can look at when was Passover in any of those years. And just for the sake of the argument, in 30 AD it was the 7th of April, and 33 it was the 3rd of April. So it was early in the year. Generally in Israel at this time, it's about 65 to 75 degrees in the day, 55 to 45 at night. I just went online, looked up last year, April 14th, this was last year, there was a high in Jerusalem of 73 degrees and a low of 39. Which means, and these are the Passover dates in the coming years. It's a little bit later, early, late, very early in 2026. So it is possible, depending on when Passover fell, if it's earlier in April, and depending on the weather that day, that it could have gotten down into the 30s, the high 30s. So when it says it was cold in Jerusalem in the springtime of the year, and the officials made a fire and they stood around the fire, it makes complete sense to me. All right. The way my mind works, I don't take that stuff for granted. I kind of want like proof. I do, yeah. And I wanted to just see if it was possible. So, moving on from 18. So 19. Now we're going to skip and we're going to take a look at Jesus' situation here with the high priest. So in verse 19, it says, "Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus said, 'I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in the synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why are you questioning me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I've said.' And when Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby," now the Greek word seems to imply an open hand, "slapped him in the face. 'Is this the way you answer the high priest?' he demanded. And Jesus responded by saying, 'If I've said something wrong, then testify to what I've said is wrong. But if I speak the truth, why do you strike me?' Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest." All right. So the first place that Jesus is taken, he's taken to the father-in-law's house. Annas was the previous high priest. He was like the godfather. Not only was his son-in-law the current high priest, but 5 of his sons later on became high priests too. So he was the powerhouse behind the high priesthood for over 50 years. So he's first taken to Annas, and Annas, I think, is kind of giving an initial assessment of Jesus and what his strategy going forward is going to be. Now, this was an illegal meeting, an illegal trial. And what immediately stands out to me is that Jesus was not in the least bit threatened by this authority figure. I mean, he just stood there. And he responded fearlessly. He was just standing there unnerved. And Jesus responds to the high priest's question with a question of his own. So the high priest kind of questioning him. Jesus responds to that questioning with a question of his own, and he essentially challenged the proceedings of the high priest. It was required in legal proceedings to have witnesses, and what the high priest was attempting to get Jesus to do is to testify against himself in a case that already had a predetermined outcome. They already thought he was guilty. They were trying to condemn him, and they're trying to get him to self-incriminate himself, in the trial. So Jesus says, "Hey, call witnesses. I've spoken openly, publicly. Call witnesses and ask." That's what you're supposed to do, and ask them what they heard. And I'm assuming that the guard that was standing next to Jesus struck him because it was perceived as being disrespectful to teach Jesus a lesson. Respond with more humility, even though Jesus didn't violate that principle. It was perceived as if he did. All right. So Matthew and Mark actually go into more detail. John covers the meeting with Annas, the high priest, the father-in-law. But Matthew and Mark cover a little bit further detail of a meeting with Caiaphas, the son-in-law, who's the official high priest. And I want to read for you. Do you want to turn to Mark chapter 14, just a few verses? As you're turning, Matthew and Mark record that a second trial takes place with Caiaphas, and they list some more ill treatment that Jesus receives during that 2-hour period. And the Sanhedrin is brought together, convened to condemn Jesus to death for blasphemy. Now, as you're turning, Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 53. Mark 14:53. As you're turning there, the Sanhedrin was the ruling body in Israel at this time. It consisted of 70 individuals. So these are our senators today, our Senate today, probably similar to some degree back then. 70 ruling individuals. Remember Nicodemus in chapter 3? He was a part of the Sanhedrin. And I only found this in one source, but I read that a quorum in the Sanhedrin was 1/3 of members present, which would be 23. And I also read that in order to pass a resolution, you needed a majority of the quorum plus 2, which means 13 members of the Sanhedrin would need to be present to pass a resolution. So a majority plus 2 of a quorum, if the quorum was only 1/3. So what I'm saying is not everyone had to be present with the Sanhedrin to condemn Jesus. And when Annas originally brought Jesus into his courtyard and was interviewing him, I think he might have dispatched his servants to go wake everybody else up, get the Sanhedrin convene them together. But if I was Annas and I had ulterior motives, I would have said, hey, Melody, don't go to Nicodemus, don't go to this person. Just get the people who are going to be on board with what the agenda that I already have. So I'm not sure if all 70 of the Sanhedrin were present and voted, or if it was just a portion of them, but legal proceedings could have essentially not required everybody to be present. All right, so in Mark chapter 14, verse 53, it says, they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and teachers of the law came together. Peter followed at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he sat with the guards warming himself at the fire. So we've already seen that information in John. The chief priests, and it says the whole Sanhedrin. So I'm assuming a majority of them, I don't know if every one of them was convened, but a majority of them were there. And they were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they didn't find any. And that's why Jesus was saying, I'm not going to testify incriminate myself. Go call witnesses, like you're supposed to do in a legal trial, and let them share. But they couldn't find it. Many testified falsely against Jesus, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave false testimony, saying, I heard this man say he'll destroy the temple made with human hands, and in 3 days he'll build another not made with hands. But even their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before Jesus and asked, aren't you going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, I charge you in the name of God. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus responds and says, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And in verse 63, it says, the high priest tore his robes. He says, why do we need any more witnesses? You've heard this blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned Jesus as worthy of death. They began to spit at him. They blindfolded him. They struck him with their fists. And they said, prophesy, who struck you? And the guards took him out and beat him. All right, so Mark goes into a little bit more detail of a second trial, the trial before Annas, the trial before Caiaphas, in the same compound. Most scholars believe that both of the palace compound there, both of them lived within the same compound, so it wouldn't have been too hard for Peter to stay in the same courtyard and still be a part, or at least listen into or observe both trials. And we see this in Mark chapter 14. Okay, so going a little bit further, verse 25. So we're going to finish up here, and then I really want to focus on this last section and I forgot my watch today, but all right. Verse 25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself, so they asked him, aren't you one of his disciples? Aren't you one of his disciples too? But he denied it, saying, I am not. Then one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him and said, didn't I see that moment the rooster began to crow? Now, Luke says at that moment, wherever Jesus was, he made eye contact with Peter, and immediately Peter realized that what Jesus had prophesied had come to fruition. He realized he denied Christ 3 times. The rooster crows, and it says he just was broke. He just broke at that moment. He ran out and he wept bitterly. So I'm not really as harsh on Peter as some people are. I don't know how you feel about this, but don't be too harsh, because I find myself in his shoes on many occasions. Peter's denial. Okay. Yeah, I'll hold on for a second. So my question is, what was the attitude of Peter's heart? What was his thinking that would cause him to respond like this?
Fear and confusion.
Yeah, I don't think it was fear as much as it was confusion. And here's why. Just 2 hours before this, Peter, one of only 2 disciples who had a sword, pulled a sword out against an overwhelming group of armed individuals and was willing to fight to the death to save Jesus. That just happened 2 hours before this. But I think what happened was this. Do you remember how Jesus responded? He didn't praise Peter for doing this. He rebuked Peter for doing this. Jesus, I should say, Peter's identity was always a fighter. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to protect Jesus. That's my role. I'm tough. I'm a fighter. And when he did that and he got rebuked by Jesus, I think it threw him off. I think it threw his identity off. And I think it really confused them. Now, all the disciples were confused because they thought that Jesus was going to be the Messiah. He's going to be the king. He's going to be a conqueror. And Peter's stepping up to the plate to risk his life for Jesus, and he gets yelled at. He gets rebuked for doing that. It's like, so I think, this is just my opinion, if I were in Peter's shoes, I feel like he's swung all the way over to the other side of the spectrum because he's confused. He doesn't understand what's going on. And he tried to do the right thing for Jesus. He got rebuked for it. And I think he's in this place now where he's not driven by fear as much as he is just desiring to follow behind Jesus and know what's going on. He's in a box. You know how men sometimes can get in a box? And I feel like he is in the box of, I'm confused. He's emotionally upset. How can I just follow behind Jesus, stay in the shadows, and figure out what's going on with this trial? So I don't really blame him too much with getting in the door with the servant girl because he's like, no, he doesn't have that on his mind. He's not trying to stand up for Jesus. He's trying to find out more about Jesus. I don't know him, and he goes in. But most scholars believe that these 3 denials took place over a window of at least an hour to 2 hours. So we might be able to excuse him for the first one, but for the second and third one, they're not happening in rapid succession. Now, maybe an hour later, and then maybe a half an hour after that, he's given a second and then a third opportunity. And both those times, his response increases in its vehement. What's the right word? Say it. Intensity. Okay, that's a different one. All right. So, yes.
Timeline, I had been taught a long way that Jesus was arrested around 2 o'clock. I'm thinking about a timeline. Around 2, 3 o'clock, the cock crowed. The Jewish day started at 6. And as you know, roosters used to crow just before sun. And
Sometimes they crow when it's still dark.
and he was taking the pilot around 6. So that meant that he was with the Pharisees and so forth, Caiaphas and Ananias, about 3 hours. And Peter witnessed all of that. And that's why I said I thought he was in.
Yeah, generally people would say that 3 a.m. was probably a rough estimate of when the rooster crowed, possibly. I don't know how long it would have taken to walk from the Garden of Gethsemane all the way back to the priest's courtyard, and then how long that... It's anybody's guess, but generally this is taking place over several hours, and and there's two legal proceedings, the one with Annas and the one with Caiaphas. So I think that's a valid question. I don't know how I don't know if anybody knows a specific answer to that question, but it's a definitely a good point. Right, it would have. Yes, correct. Yep. So quick question. I'm going to come to a conclusion here, but I really want to focus on this concept just a little bit longer. What does it mean to deny Christ? The first thing I thought came to mind, and this is something that Jesus said recorded in Matthew chapter 10. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will acknowledge it before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. And there's a subsequent passage in Luke chapter 12 that basically says the same thing. So we can deny Jesus with our words, either with our words or by not speaking at all. We can probably deny him. Okay? And then also, I thought of this one in Titus chapter 1, verse 16. He's saying that people claim to know God, but by their actions they deny him. Now, I think in context here, he's talking about unbelievers. But it's very clear if an unbeliever can deny Christ, not acknowledge Christ, deny him with their words and actions, they're unsaved. That makes sense. But the real question becomes, for a believer, what if you're a genuine believer and we deny Jesus? I mean, the fear is, do you lose your salvation? And that's a huge question in and of itself. One more passage that came up. Now, we're called not to deny Christ, but who are we called to deny? Ourselves. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus said, anybody who wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. So really, the question becomes, whenever we put self before Jesus, we're technically denying Jesus. Almost all the time, even in Peter's case, even if it was because of fear, I am thinking more of myself than I am of Jesus, and that's why when I'm in that pressure, I choose self over him. Okay? And in a sense, that led to the denial. So there's always a cost associated with following Christ. We're called to deny ourselves, not to deny Christ. Peter denied Christ. Jesus never denied himself. I mean, he remains faithful. He remained true to who he was. What did Peter learn as a result of, what lesson did he learn as a result of his circumstances? In history, and I brought this is terrible. This is really, I mean, this is horrific. You can't even imagine what it's like. That this is in Mozambique. This is Voice of the Martyrs. Just a little section. On another day that spring, the Islamists gathered everyone in Pastor Mateo's village and asked them a single question. They surrounded the village, gathered everybody together, went right down the line. What religion are you? Those who answered Christian were immediately decapitated, and pastors and their families were killed in especially gruesome, torturous ways. In all, 70 villagers died in the attack. 70 people at least. You know? Kneel. Everybody kneel, line up, go right down the list, and they asked them. And what you responded, I don't know for certain. Maybe they asked you some verses in the Quran. If you couldn't repeat them, they knew you were, sometimes they do that. Are you a Christian or Muslim? I'm a Muslim. Okay, repeat this in the Quran. And if you couldn't do it, maybe he's a Christian, he's lying. But all throughout history, there have been many, many circumstances, many stories of Christians who have denied Christ in order to save their life. And I don't know, I would hope that I would remain true to, that's a scary thought for all of us, right? It's, and that's why I think we should wrestle with it now, especially as America turns more and more toward persecution. We want to remain faithful. We don't want to deny Christ. But I think here's what Peter learned in this process. I think he realized that this is really a warning against self-confidence and pride. Because pride can cloud an accurate view that we have of ourselves. Boasting in our abilities is an invitation for failure. I think back on all the times that I boasted that I could, and God has this way of humbling you to realize you cannot do it in your own power, in your own strength. Whether it's sports related, which God taught me a lot of humble lessons, or anything. Even with the responsibilities or the ministry responsibilities that he gives us. We literally can't do it on our own. Jesus needs to get all the credit. And I think Peter had too great of a confidence in his own abilities rather than in Christ. And Jesus showed him that was simply not true. Now, what's really interesting with this is that Jesus was the one that initiated the forgiveness. When Peter screwed up, Jesus was the one that pursued Peter. We'll see it again in John chapter 21. But when Peter goes to him and basically rectifies, restores the relationship and forgives Peter. But my wife pointed out something really, really important this week. I tend to be a performance-based person. Have you ever felt like you failed Jesus? Have you ever felt like you failed Jesus? You made a mistake, you screwed up. The shame and the guilt and the feelings of failure can really inhibit a person. And I have felt that personally. Sometimes it's hard to you don't even want to look up to heaven because you feel like you failed him. You feel guilty. So on Peter's end of the relationship, a lot changed. A tremendous amount changed. He felt completely different in his relationship. But you know what's true? Jesus, on his side of the relationship, nothing changed at all. Because Jesus never chose Peter because of what Peter did or didn't do. Remember, on Jesus' end, it's all about grace. It's about unconditional love. So on Peter's end, and I think we can all relate to this, we view our relationship with God based upon our performance. But on Jesus' end, it's not based on performance. He loves us unconditionally, And it doesn't matter what we do or don't do, or he still is the one that's pursuing us, and he desires oneness with us. And we see that with Peter. If I could summarize, I could say Jesus felt the same way toward Peter regardless of what happened. But Peter didn't feel the same way toward Jesus because he measured his relationship with Jesus based upon his own actions and his own failure. So what do we do when we feel like we failed Jesus? I think we need to realize that Jesus loves us unconditionally. His love doesn't change. It's not based upon our actions. That's really hard for me to say because I'm an earn it type person. So even saying that feels uncomfortable saying that, but there's truth in those statements. And all throughout the Old Testament, when the Israelites sinned, when they walked away from God, when they committed adultery, God was the one that pursued them. And every time God says, hey, just repent, return to me, and I'll restore the relationship. Satan wants to use guilt, failure, and shame to separate us from Christ, but Jesus is always pursuing us to say, come back, and I want to restore that I want to restore that oneness with you. So in a sense, shame and guilt are a self-inflicting wound. And sometimes it's hard for us to get over those feelings in our relationship with God. We feel like we've let him down, but we need to realize that he still loves us unconditionally. Now, I thought there would be no better way to conclude this today by just showing you a 3-minute clip from The Chosen, okay? So this is a 3-minute clip, and we'll close out on this. And then I want to, Debbie and Scott, would you guys be willing this Sunday to maybe come up after we play this video and just be present up front? If anyone here is currently struggling with perhaps, specifically, you feel like you failed, or you feel guilty in some fashion, and you need the forgiveness of Christ. Sometimes it's hard to appropriate. We know that he forgives us, but we don't want to receive it, or we reject it because we feel like we don't deserve it, and we don't deserve forgiveness, but he still offers it nonetheless. So if there's anyone that's really struggling with anything for guilt or shame or feeling like a failure, and you just want somebody to pray for you, Debbie, I know you and Scott, we excellent candidates to just pray over anybody who, if there is anyone in the room who may need prayer for that or anything else. So after we watch this, I want to, maybe I'll close this out in prayer, and then you two can kind of station yourselves up front as we conclude service and just for ministry opportunities. So here in The Chosen, Mary Magdalene, whom Jesus rescues and restores and saves, you know what she does? Something triggers in her, and she goes back to her old lifestyle. And Jesus dispatches Peter and Matthew to go find her and bring her back. And we're going to pick up a little clip, it's a 3-minute clip of her coming back to the camp when she's screwed up so much. So I hope you can hear that.
Don't take it away.